Do you know the two fastest growing churches in the world today are from the most oppressive anti-Christian governments from around the globe? Or the Jubilee year of 1917, where land must be restored to its rightful owner, was the same year the British Empire released the title deed of Israel to the Jewish people. Or perhaps the appearance of 4 successive blood moons falling on Jewish feasts in 1967 and 68 was the same year Jerusalem was once again in Jewish hands after the victory of the Six-Day War. Join us now as we uncover our recent headlines, peering through the lens of prophetic scriptures as God's Word intercepts man's calendar. I am Mark Russick, and you are listening to The Russick Outlook. As always, just my opinion. Hello, greetings everyone. Hi, how are you? My name is Mark Russick. You're listening to The Russick Outlook. Thank you for joining us today. I believe you'll find much of this information, if not all of it, quite riveting. We're looking at what I've called Yahweh's calendar, which is God the Father, and from creation right up and through modern day 2021, where we are today. I'm near the end of June as I'm recording this broadcast, and I will bring you up to the headlines right up and through the end of June, because they do pertain to what's going on as far as what the Bible has to say, as well as some of the signs that Jesus laid out to his apostles and disciples when they said, what will be the signs of your coming. So we're going to look into that, as well as the geopolitical landscape. We're going to touch on some of the cultural, financial issues that do line up with what is to come according to the book of Revelation and other things that we see. And just in general, kind of a temperature check, if you will. So if you like subjects like this, or you appreciate this, please hit the like and subscribe button, as well as ring the bell. Ring that bell on YouTube. And if you can, share the information. There's usually a share button whatever platform you're watching it on. If you wouldn't mind getting it out. If you think this information is relevant and you like it, or you think others might benefit from it, it really helps us get information out, which is, as I've said many times before, that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to get to the truth and exchange truth so that people can be informed and make decisions on what they need to do for themselves as well as for their families. So, again, we're going to be looking at these past 100 years. We're going to kind of wind up this section of looking at the calendar, where I'm calling this Prophecy Intercepts Man's Calendar. Man, more often than not, has their own agenda. It doesn't always line up with God, but God's got this way of massaging and kind of tweaking, if you will, and presenting counter moves to Satan's strategies to defeat mankind, as well as defeat the plan of God, which we know can never happen. Which is also a great thing and a great place to be at. So if you're following me on video, you see just a kind of a montage of images here that I'm pointing out, just some major events of the past 100 years, starting with what is perceived as being the hand of God in charge of the timeline. But at the top, we're looking at the World Economic Forum, so the recent bombings that we saw in the Gaza Strip with Hamas. You see Israeli flags and planes. That's from the 1967 Six-Day War. American riots that we saw in 2020. The election chaos. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because, I'm coming from America, where there was just chaos. That is the appropriate word, but we're seeing that elsewhere. We're seeing it in Israel, and we're seeing it also in other countries. Some of the things that really do jump out at me, the headlines of COVID, the nuclear talks that are going on right now between a lot of Western European nations and the United States, and some, I believe there's some Canadian involvement there, trying to get to back to the 2015 Accord. So, there you see some nuclear plants that are in Iran, but probably one of the most compelling stories that I believe, especially these past couple of years, you're looking at two churches, underground churches in the lower right-hand corner, what I call the underground church, and you see some redaction having going on in the faces of some of these people for their protection. The top image above the nuclear facilities is an Iranian underground church, and to the left of that is a Chinese church. And I chose those two because, believe it or not, those are two of the largest growing churches or areas of the world where Christianity is spreading at an alarming, not alarming, and a good alarm, I should say. And I think it's worth noting that in the middle of the chaos of what we're seeing with communist China and their involvement with COVID-19 and or however you want to put that, whether they're withholding information, and then you see what's going on with Iran and they're leading basically the number one provider or a leader of terrorism around the world, and they've got these proxies throughout the Middle East. So we're going to talk all about that, but I do wanted to highlight the underground church and that Jesus Christ is alive and well and on the throne, and despite some of the things that you see around us, he is in charge. Lower left, the Balfour Accord, which we're going to talk about shortly. And then the World Economic Forum, which is a lot of the crowd from Davos and the economy and what they're trying to do and kind of tweak what's going on with COVID. So we're going to look at all of that and how that may line up with the eventual second coming of Jesus. So this is the same timeline that I've been referencing in the past broadcast, and to the left, from the top left over to the right, it's being displayed kind of a linear. And we left off in 1867. I talked a lot about Mark Twain and Charles Warren, and believe it or not, what I think are, their involvement in Jerusalem at this time was mentioned specifically in the Bible. And you can go back to that and listen to that if you want. It's pretty detailed. But that, I believe, is really, that timeline in there is really what I believe kind of kicks the gears in motion, if you will, to where things are speeding up. And I think everybody senses that time is moving pretty quickly. So we're talking about, if you look at 1517 to 1867, that's when the Ottoman Empire, that was the last title deed exchange, and the Ottoman Empire was in charge of the land of Palestine, which was what it was called. Israel was called at that time, and we've talked about jubilees being 50 years, and there was 7 times 7, which was where 1867 would bring you, from 1517 to 1867, and that's when I believe that the things really started to move. That's when Twain was there and the stranger writing about the curses of the land, as well as Charles Warren, who surveyed the land, as written in Zechariah. So that's where we're at, and I just wanted to touch on that for a second to emphasize the significance of what we're going to see in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, basically handing the title deed to Israel. And just before that, beginning in 1914, you have the start of World War I, which, because of the victory there, enabled the Brits to basically give this land over to the Hebrew people, the Hebrew nation. So let me just jump to this real quick, and then we'll come back to this timeline. So here you see the Ottoman Empire, and on the left there's a black and white photograph of the Ottoman Empire leaving Jerusalem, and the Brits taking their control, and then that was eventually handed over to the Jewish people. 1517 is when Selim I defeated the armies of Mamluk, and that's when the Ottoman Empire took over. And then we saw that 1867 is when the land was being measured, and that was the beginning of the strategy of the Lord. And I'll say it specifically, that is where things kicked in motion, and the timing is obviously very specific. So in December of 1916, the government of the British Prime Minister had collapsed, and I should say that they were not in favor at that time of handing the land to the Zionists, to the Jewish people. But it was succeeded by David Lloyd George, who appointed Arthur Balfour as his foreign secretary. And because of that, and his belief that this land belonged to the Jewish people, he wrote up the Balfour Accords, which eventually got the approval of President Woodrow Wilson, which was, again, America had a big impact in the freedom for the Jewish people in Israel. So the Jubilee of 1917 became the year of the Gizerah, the decree. You declare that that land must be returned to its rightful owner, and sure enough, it became to its rightful owner. So again, there you have the eighth. So you had the 7 sevens, which led up from 1517 to 1867. Then the eighth was actually that Jubilee of Jubilees. And that's when the decree was handed over. So in the Jubilee, the land must be returned to those whom it belongs to with legal authority. The land of Israel was returned by proclamation to the Jewish people, those to whom it belonged, coming with the authority of the world's preeminent empire, which was the British Empire at the time. It was the 50th year from the Jubilee seeds, that which had been planted in the first Jubilee came to fruition in the second. So 1867, the release of the land begins. 1917, the release of the land becomes fulfilled. So it's very, very specific. So you see God's hand is in that as that title deed was transferred. Just a side note, Jerusalem was liberated on December 9th, 1917. This was the beginning of Hanukkah. So on the evening of the day Jerusalem was liberated, Jewish people all over the world lit Jewish lights. That night sealed Jerusalem's liberation, and the ending of its occupation happened to be at the start of this ancient holiday that celebrates Jerusalem's liberation. Love how God works. So, there you have it. I wanted to just kind of set the stage that 1917 was very, very crucial and important in man's history and the world's history. So picking up, you can now go into 1939 to 45, World War II. This may or may not have been highlighted in Scripture where Jesus talks about nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Those world wars could have been the birth pains, as he called it. I did want to mention, obviously, the Holocaust and the tragedy of that, but an emphasis that, you had approximately 6 million Jews, and I would say that now we know there's over 11 million throughout Europe, if you want to include, and I do, you should include, what happened in Poland and Russia, that you had 11 million Jews executed because of vile satanic hatred of the Jewish people, of the anti-Semitism that unfortunately is rising again around the world today. So consider 1945, you had all these Jewish people executed, but yet God kept calling his people back to the land. And in 1948, in a day, the nation was declared, which is just what Isaiah said. How can a nation be declared in a day? And sure enough, it did. So I wanted to then look at the 4 blood moons, because that happened again between 49 and 50. I mentioned this last time. Blood moons, they occurred. The last one, if you look at 1492 to 1493, now 49 to 50. I point out that was the same year Columbus discovered America, as well as when the Jews were expelled from Spain. And then it didn't happen again until 49 and 50. But each time it happens, it falls on the Jewish holidays. It falls, in this case, on Passover and Sukkot. So what happened in 49 and 50? Well, that's when the Israeli government was established. The nation came to be in 1948 on May 14th, but the government takes a while to get built up and established. So between those 2 years, the government was built, and sure enough, you have 4 blood moons there. Coincidence? You decide. Jumping over to the Six-Day War in 67 and 68. That is where the hand of God was on the Jewish people, liberated them from attacks from the enemy, from their surrounding neighbors of Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Egypt. But sure enough, in 6 miraculous days, although they were vastly outnumbered, they won that war and a great deal of land, the Golan Heights, and most importantly, East Jerusalem. So now the entire city became liberated, as well as they captured back the Sinai Peninsula in what would be to their south in northern Egypt. And sure enough, you had 4 blood moons again happening in that 67, 68 window. So, again, is this coincidence? So, we're seeing these ties specifically to events that are happening in or impacting Jerusalem, impacting Israel, and they're falling specifically on these Jewish holidays. Jump to 73, Yom Kippur War. Same thing, enemies surround them. They try to trick them or surprise them while they're celebrating Yom Kippur in their homes, in their synagogues. But again, God just miraculously delivers them. To the point where you jump to 1979, you have two major events in my eyes. The Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, where Anwar Sadat, who played a big role in the strategies of the wars in 73 and 67, he eventually made peace with Israel. And so he and Menachem Begin formed the peace accord in 1979. He shortly thereafter was assassinated because many in the Muslim Brotherhood and other Muslims felt he had betrayed the Muslim religion. At the same time, over in Iran, you had the Iranian Revolution, and I believe, that's one of the major events of the 20th century. I think if history looks back at, the things that happened, obviously the two world wars were just enormous impact, but I believe the Iranian Revolution had an impact and has an impact today around the world, because not only what they're doing in the Middle East, but obviously that impacts what is going on around the world today. Jump to 2014 and 2015, another 4 blood moons. And this was at the same time the Jewish people were finally allowed access to the Temple Mount. Coincidence? You decide. And then, you have more access to the Temple Mount today, which obviously, is the sticking point that the Muslim people will rely on as far as their battle for Jerusalem. Next, you go to 2017, and this is another jubilee. If you look from 67 to 68, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I mentioned this or not, and I apologize if I didn't. The blue lines on the top, so 1917, the jubilee, you go 50 years, that's 67, that's the Six-Day War. So from the handover of the title deed of the land of Israel, another jubilee passes by, and the city of Jerusalem is liberated. So now you have a completion of Israel and Jerusalem being as one, and sure enough, that happened exactly in 50 years. Fast forward another 50 years to 2017, and I believe this is tied to it as well. It's when America came into agreement, what I believe, with the King of Heaven by saying Jerusalem is, in fact, the capital of Israel. And they recognized it as a nation, moved their consulate from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and now you have roughly 5 or 6 more nations, smaller nations, but it's coming, and I believe that is tied to the Jubilee, another from 67 on to 2017. Another thing happened in 2017. I'm going to touch on briefly. And maybe a little bit more near the end. But if you can look this up, I don't have time to really dig in deep on this. But there's Revelation 12. There says there will be a sign in the heavens, and I'll read that scripture shortly. But I just wanted to point out that on September 23rd, 2017, this sign specifically happened in the heavens, exactly as described in Revelation 12. That was 2 days after the Feast of Trumpets. So, is that a sign or not? I believe it is. Many people, Christians, who disagree, because some people at the time knew it was coming, and they, claimed that this was going to be the return of God and the second coming. And because it didn't, I think some people felt like they maybe had egg on their face. I don't know. But I believe this is a sign. The sun, the moon, and the stars are given for seasons and for signs, according to Genesis. So I don't believe that was a coincidence, and that everything the way it lined up had not happened in almost 7,000 years. And sure enough, it happened on that date. I'm going to be doing a deeper presentation on that shortly down the road, but I did want to point out that happened in 2017, and I believe it was important. 2020, a crazy, crazy year, and 2021, obviously, as well. So COVID is undoubtedly the story of 2020 and the Great Reset, but not only what we suffered through medically, and the loss of life was just horrendous. But it was a biological attack, and I don't think we can get around that. Whether you want to disagree or you're not sure, and that's fair, whether this was released prematurely or not. But regardless, it was a man-made virus for a biological warfare. I don't think there's any question about that. We know that it came from Wuhan, China. I don't think there isn't any question about that. It's just the silliness of political correctness that people want to dance around that subject. But that's what happened, and you can make a case, I would say, that it might have not been intentionally gotten out at that time, but nonetheless, it was used strategically as a weapon to advance other agendas by the machine that's pushing for a one world government. And so that really came into play in 2020. You have the economic impacts. You've got the Davos crowd. You've got the World Economic Forum. You've got Bill Gates and his agenda with getting the vaccines, but also using it for tracking. You can say that lines up with what Revelation states, that you will not be able to buy, trade, or sell unless you have the mark of the beast. This is not the mark of the beast, but it could be a little bit of a trial run, or it could be kind of greasing the skids, if you will, where they're going to find out information on how that can help them. But it so much of the infrastructure is already in place from what they've done there, and they're obviously using it with a hidden agenda in mind, to kind of move things along to population control, to economic control, one world government. I mean, all of this is I would hope is very obvious to the listener. It is to many people, and specifically, I will say, if people who are familiar with the book of Revelation, they can see the symmetry that goes on there. Jumping to 2021, where I'm saying election chaos, and I talked about it. Again, I'm from America, so the chaos that we saw in this country with the 45th to the 46th president was an absolute travesty and absurd and dangerous, what's going on, because it just goes to show the impact of foreign governments and how they are infiltrated into America, and there's just there's no way around it. But so let me say 45 to 46 was very premature. Then you had the election chaos of what's gone on in Israel, and I'll talk about that shortly. But while I'm on America, I just wanted to say one thing here. There are some early results coming out from the polls, from Pew's research and some others, that it looks like in 2020 the numbers are going to be over 90% of evangelicals voted for the 45th president. I don't know the numbers on the Catholics. I know there was 63% approximately in 2016, and so that inevitably will go up because there was around 84 to 85% for evangelicals in 2016. And given all of the obvious policies that were pro, I would say fall in line with the support of life, the fight against abortion, principally the alignment with Israel, and so many other things that built up the economy. You had the best economy ever before COVID, so you had a lot of nastiness go on. But my point here is they've nullified the church. The church, if you look at in America, is larger than any of the two principal parties. So if they can learn to coalesce together and work together, unfortunately, they get fractured because the powers that be realize, how can we separate and break up the church because it's to their advantage. But I just wanted to point out that they went after and they nullified a lot of the church's vote as well. So let me switch to some other electoral chaos. So what's going on in Israel, what happened there recently, many are, I'm sure, aware, but they had their fourth election. They could not settle in on a government. The way their government is laid out, you have 120 seats in the Knesset. You need to have a majority to form a government. for the past 2 years, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was not ever really able to form a government. On this last election, I think 30, I'm going to say somewhere around 35 seats or so, if that, not nearly enough. And he was not able to bring together other parties to help unify his government. So, long story short, it wound up this allegiance of many different parties. I think up to 7 different parties have now formed a government. And what's very odd about this time is you just came out of a tremendous war with Hamas on the Gaza Strip, went on for a couple of weeks. And within a week or two of this major war, Israel now has a new president. They have a new prime minister, a new government, and a new head of the Mossad. So all of this has happened within weeks, coming out of a major war. So that in of itself is a little leery. And then the way they've kind of patchworked this government together with different factors from the right, from the left. For the first time, you have Muslim seats in the majority on the government. Some from the, I think it's 4 seats from the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's a fractured government, and the way they did it was you now have Naftali Bennett, who was only able to obtain 7 seats in the election, but he is now the prime minister of Israel. He formed some kind of deal with Yair Lapid, who is kind of positioning himself as a centrist. So they struck a deal, you to be prime minister for 2 years, then he'll be prime minister for 2 years. So it's a very patchwork, very sketchy, very leery thing. And the reason I'm kind of pointing electoral chaos is because not only what you see in Israel there, but because of America's electoral chaos, and the policies have completely flipped from 45 to 46. You don't have that allegiance with Israel. You have some goings on behind the scenes. You're funneling money to Palestinians, which we know is not going into the rightful hands. So in other words, it's not going back to infrastructure to build up the cities and the hospitals and the educational systems, which if the money was going there, that would be great. But we know from history from the past 50, 60 years that that's not the case. And I'm not going to break all of that down. But needless to say, 46th president is doing what the 44th president wanted, and some will say they're working behind the scenes together. Which their push in 44 was trying to get the Israeli borders back to the 67 lines, which it's kind of signing their death warrant. And so today you have the 46th president. He's advocating a two-state solution, which we know will never work. But on that note, I also wanted to talk about the Abraham Accords. So this was initiated by the 45th president and Netanyahu, as well as peace accords that were signed with Bahrain and the UAE. Since then, Morocco has come on board. The reason I wanted to bring this up is some people feel like that was the beginning of their demise. I don't know. I didn't see any land for peace deal exchange, and I think that's what some Christians are saying. They may know more than I do, but I don't know that. But they feel like that could have been the reason that the 45th president is no longer, as well as the prime minister of Israel is no longer. So, you can take that for what it's worth. I don't see where that is. I may be wrong. There is peace there, which is always a good thing if it doesn't come with, anything down the road. From what I can see, it's an exchange of intelligence, which is absolutely a good thing, as well as trade, tourism. You're able to exchange to different religious sites. It's obviously very important for the Muslims to get to the Temple Mount. And not to say that there's not some things behind the scenes that are not good. I believe it's the UAE, might be Bahrain, I'm not sure. I know that I've read some things over the past couple of days where they're building this World Council of Churches, where they're putting a Christian church, a synagogue, and a Muslim temple all within, the same grounds. And, so that is just kind of pushing more towards a one world religion. But I just wanted to point that out. So what's around the corner? Well, let me just point out that the Battle of Magog, Gog of Magog, Ezekiel 38 and 39. We've talked a lot about this, and if you're watching this on video, I'm showing you the map, and they're giving you the Old Testament names of these nations, which are predominantly the big ones here would be Russia, Turkey, and what's called Persia. Obviously, that's Iran. But what's interesting is all three of these nations now have military in Syria, which is on the northern border of Israel. Does that mean it's around the corner? No, but it doesn't mean that it's not. Anything can kick off a war. There's a lot of reasons why they would want to go in, and according to Ezekiel, it's to plunder their booty, and which basically means a lot of the resources that Israel has is of strategic importance, namely gas, but certainly all of the vast riches in the Dead Sea and the chemicals and how that advances in medical science and just a whole host of things. And the richness of Israel, this little land the size of New Jersey is just blossoming in the desert, and all the surrounding areas are not, and that's the hand of God. Where this nation came to be in 1948, and I just recently, within the last month, it was ranked number 18 in the world economically. This tiny little country that's not even 100 years old is now the 18th most powerful economic engine. You look at their technology, as far as the city of Tel Aviv, and so many of the big tech giants have headquarters there now. The inventions that's coming out, the patents that's coming out there. Obviously, the military. I could make a point for the top 5, but everybody would say they're at least in the top 10 militarily. So that's kind of pointing out to the blessings of God. But nonetheless, God says in Ezekiel, "I will put a hook in your jaw and pull you out," which means really pointing to Russia and the southern stand countries, as well as parts of Ethiopia and Libya and northern Africa. So that is the next great war. But there are many things that are lining up geopolitically, economically, socially, religiously. And again, a lot of these nations are Muslim, and they want access to the Temple Mount. Namely Turkey, they're really pushing for jurisdiction there. It's now controlled by Jordan. Saudi Arabia, because of Mecca and Medina, they want a hand in there. And the southern stand countries, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, all of those countries are Muslim nations. So, there is obviously everything is kind of set in motion for an attack on Israel. So it's time. Signs of the end of the age, and we've talked about it. I mentioned about Jesus, and talking about these signs are birth pains. But he also said, if you follow me on the lower left, the lesson of the fig tree. Israel is the fig tree. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, that he is near at the gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until these things take place. To the right, I show you Psalm 90:10. How long is a generation? The days of our life are 70 years, or even, if because of strength, 80 years. So, 70 to 80 years after Israel becomes a nation, whether that means 1948, possibly, very possibly. Could it be tied to the 67 freedom for Jerusalem? Yeah, sure. I mean, we don't know the day or the hour, but we do know the season. So the season is drawing near, and I've said this before, could be 5 years, could be 10 years, but even if it's 100 years, that's not a long time away. So that's how close we're getting. I mentioned about the signs in the skies that we saw. That was Revelation 12. Just wanted to read this. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and her head a garland of 12 stars. Then being with child, she cried out in labor, and in pain gave birth. Another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great and fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on its head. Its tail drew a third of the stars out of heaven and threw them to the earth. We know that stars refer to the angels. We know that there was a third of the angels were thrown out of heaven with Satan. And the dragon, who is Satan, stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as it was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God that she should feed her here with 1,260 days. So I just wanted to point out that this was a sign in the heavens. You can look this up. Again, I'll do a little bit of a longer deep dive on it shortly. But it's a fascinating look. And this exact sign happened in the heavens on September 23rd, 2017. So I just wanted to point that out. I personally do believe that that was a sign for us to pay attention. I'm just going to close with where are we now? So if you look to the left of this chart that I have, it says today's world ecclesia, which is the governing church of Jesus. It's the global church. It's not broken down to denominations, but that is a church that is praying and believing for the hand of God, for the miraculous to happen, to come down, for a great move of the Spirit, for signs and wonders. And I kind of point out here with a black and white sketch of the parting of the Red Sea, because people have believed that the Lord is preparing a Red Sea type of moment where he will deliver his people miraculously, which will usher in the great last move of Holy Spirit. It'll be similar to some of the great awakenings that we've seen in the past. But I wanted to point that out, and because there's ridicule to some of these prophets that are speaking and proclaiming some of this. But they're standing in faith like many, and God bless them, because this is something to believe for, because we want all to come and receive the gospel message. But if you look to the right, where are we? Well, the war of Gog of Magog, what I just talked about, could be right around the corner. And I personally believe that will happen before the rapture of the church. It's not utterly conclusive. It could come after. Shortly thereafter. I've given my reasons in the past why I believe, what I do based upon Scripture. But there you have, the peace treaty that I believe will kind of set things in motion. That will be the precursor that will get to the treaty for the signing of in the third temple. And then Jesus says, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. So we don't know the day of the hour, but we certainly know the season. And Jesus said, when you see these signs coming, look up, for your redemption draweth nigh. So we're seeing a lot of the signs. I'm just pointing these things out. But also, I want to point out to 2 Peter, because I really believe this is very important. In verse 3, chapter 3, he says, knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lust, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. For this they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, the earth standing out of the water and in the water, by which the world that existed perished, being flooded with water. So, it's about the flood there, but it starts with there will be scoffers, there will be naysayers, there will be people who are saying, where is this Jesus? Or you're a holy roller, or this or that. That's to be expected. So if somebody is saying that to you, take it as a compliment. It goes to verse 7, it says, but the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. That day of judgment is coming. And so if people are going to scoff at you or make fun of you, or if you're listening and you don't know Jesus and you're not sure, ask him. Seek him. If some of these things that I'm laying out for you register with you, because ultimately this is what is at stake, your life here on earth, but also your life in eternity. And for that matter, if you are not a believer, then, too, I would say this could be impacting your family, your loved ones, your wife, your husband, your father, your mother, your son, your daughter, your granddaughter, your friends, your co-workers, etc. So there's so much at stake. There's so much to look into. So I hope that you do that. I believe that if we're looking at these through the lens of Scripture, we can see the events of these past 100 years, where I say prophecy intercepts the calendar of man. I think it's pretty obvious. So, take it for what it's worth, and I hope you find some value in this. So as always, I'd just like to thank you for your time again. I'm very, very appreciative. If you can, please hit the like and subscribe button. It really helps us a lot. like and subscribe button. Plus, share the video. Share these things if you think it's worthwhile, if you think somebody will get something out of it. Questions, comments, suggestions, always here, russickoutlook@gmail.com. My name is Mark Russick. You've been listening to the Russick Outlook. And remember, as always, just my opinion.